Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Happy days are here again. And, well, understanding a question is half of an answer, and this is half the answer. This is your host, Trent R. Nelson, and of course, I'm joined as always by host Caitlin M. Green. We are editors with Liberal Currents, linguist, historian, but we like to have a lot of fun. We have a lot of hats, not just this one. And Caitlin, well, we got a very special guest today, do we not?
Yes, we do. I'm so excited to welcome Eiynah. She's a Canadian illustrator, host of the podcast Polite Conversations, and researcher of the far right, IDW, and all the rationalist shenanigans that happen in those kind of social and intellectual groups. I hesitate to say intellectual. Eiynah, how are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Eiynah has, of course, had me on her podcast a few times, plus some Twitter spaces before things happened to Twitter to make everything harder for everybody. And we've always had a really great time. I really, really respect your dedication to research and understanding like all of the rationalizations that happen that allow certain public figures to package and sell some really terrible ideas to people. So that's what I want to talk about today.
Cool.
Yeah.
Let's go.
So can you tell me a little bit about your background interacting with like the intellectual dark web, the new atheists, the ex-Muslim community, that kind of stuff?
Yes. So I hear that we are here to talk about Islamophobia a little bit today. I want to put all my cards on the table before I have that discussion. I am not a believing Muslim. In fact, I am an ex-Muslim who has gone through a bit of a teenage edgelord atheist phase. Grew out of that in my 30s.
Yes.
Listen, we all do it when we do it, okay?
Caitlin and I talk about it all the time.
Right.
You know, there are phases of belief. There's belief and there's rejection. And then sometimes for some people, there's a third one too.
Yeah, like an angry lashing out.
Yeah.
Look, in my defense, I grew up in a theocracy. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I was exposed to like some harsh treatment by the state. There was morality police walking around. It seems insane to like say this stuff. I don't want to be like that person from North Korea that goes on Joe Rogan's podcast and like makes these bizarre claims.
No, right? You're that person. No, you're that person from Saudi Arabia coming on to have the answer to make claims.
Yeah. You're not saying like they gave every child a puppy and then took it away. You're like literally saying what happened. So.
Right. Yeah.
We need that.
So there was literal morality police roaming the streets to kind of police if your headscarf was falling. And I saw them like hit my mom's ankle with a cane one time when we were in the market. And I mean, these were traumatizing events, even though my parents weren't like extremely strict or religious. These events happen to me regardless. I know that people like to discredit my perspective as an inauthentic ex-Muslim because I didn't come from a family that like, beat me and forced me into modesty garb. But the state did. I mean, the state didn't beat me, but,
I know.
Yeah.
Why would that cause people to call your experience inauthentic?
Because the ex-Muslims that they like to prop up and fund and do all sorts of things for are the people that say things like, well, if you allow Muslim immigration, then you're going to be destroying Western civilization.
Right.
We need more white people making babies and just weird weird stuff like that, retweeting Steve Saylor, promoting fascist breeding conferences.
Right.
I am not one of those people. Therefore, I am not an authentic ex-Muslim, according to some people.
I see.
In fact, you represent kind of a betrayal, right? Because you could have become one of these people that their whole brand was sort of talking about how Islam is kind of never acceptable, that people need to always be disavowing the most extreme aspects of Islam in order to be acceptable in the Western world. And I think you probably would have done a really good job if you had just like killed off your soul, right? You're
yes.
but you wouldn't, right? So,
well, in my earlier, angrier days, I never came at it from the perspective of like fear mongering about immigrants or Muslims or anything or minorities. But I did like have a lot of anger about like forced modesty and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I did focus a lot of my content on the Islamic right, you can say. Mm-hmm. And then I gained this audience of these prominent atheists and large Twitter accounts who really encouraged and celebrated everything I said. And I saw it change like overnight almost as soon as I had the same sort of criticism about the Western right.
Right.
So it was really disorienting.
So those kinds of criticisms just weren't welcome in these, even though these were like atheist organizations and their whole thing is about individual liberty. That just wasn't something they wanted to talk much about.
No, in fact, they turned into like these hardcore apologists, like within seconds.
Because the fact of what you're talking about is really just the cover. They use the fact that there is this terribleness to highlight Islam, which is not inherently, when practiced in kind, responsible ways, any more dreadful than Judaism or Christianity. And yet they don't focus on those individuals in any group that are abusing an ideology. Why do you think that is, Eiynah?
I think with Christians especially, it is, well, now we can see that they are not just not focusing or looking away, they are actively in bed with the evangelical Christian right. And they're kind of on the same mission to take down the left and to put minorities back in their place.
Yeah, so I was really, like, this shouldn't be a surprise to me, right? But it was, which is that I went to, what is it called? Atheists for Liberty.
Oh, that's like one of the worst.
I know. So, because I was interested in, like, the atheist response to when Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, right, went on an interview and said, I identify as a cultural Christian, right? Mm-hmm. And he explained like what he meant, and you can almost walk along with him for a minute and then it gets weird, right? But essentially what it was he looked around himself in London and he saw decorations that were for Ramadan.
How
and he was
could
like,
they?
I can't accept this, right? So he said, he says, I love hymns and Christmas carols. I sort of feel at home in a Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. And then he said, I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful, which obviously he's thinking about Islam because he's talking about Ramadan, right?
Right.
So to me, I was like, I'm almost there. Like, I'm a cultural Christian myself, right? I was raised Christian. I celebrate all the holidays. But it doesn't like threaten me at all for other religions to also have attention.
Of course.
So I looked on Atheists for Liberty because I was like, well, what do they think if they're all about freedom and rationality and atheism? And they were like, this isn't new. Richard Dawkins has said that he's a cultural Christian for a long time.
He has,
and the fact is, what did this author say? It was Rolling Kaloti, and he said, in my opinion, there is nothing more vulgar, more dangerous, more irrational than Islam. It has a worse track record than any religion. And if I had to pick between the two religions, I would also reluctantly go for Christianity.
But
And
what is their metric? Like,
right.
anytime you break this down, it's nonsense,
Of
because
course.
even Dawkins, when pressed during that very interview, she asked him why, and he was like, well, because Christianity is a fundamentally decent religion and Islam is a fundamentally indecent religion. And then she
Right.
was like, well, why?
On what
And
basis? Yeah.
he's like, well, because, like, they treat women badly or something, whereas, Christians, they have a little bit of, they have some problems with, like, say, female priests or something. Don't quote me on the exact words, but something along those lines. But
No,
he's
and
taking a very small slice of time, right?
they almost could have fooled me because I grew up in a specific version of Christianity where women did have positions of power, but that is actually not that common.
Right. Yeah.
And even somewhere they have like some lip service to women having authority. They're like, oh, but like when we do like a vote of the board, the women don't actually get a vote. It's like, okay, so what was the point? So yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it comes back to this idea that you might think you're not Islamophobic, you might think that you're not racist, but when you go selectively for them on the basis of supposedly progressive values like women's rights, right, or LGBTQ rights, or peace, even, that like it involves putting a lot of blinkers on, right?
Yeah, and actually, I feel like just the past year and a half has been so eye-opening,
Right.
because you see that Zionist apologetics revolves around many of the same talking points, and that weaponized feminism, weaponized LGBT rights, when things aren't exactly great within their own setup.
Yeah, so something like, I can't believe you're caping for Palestine when, they would absolutely like stone queer people to death. And it's like, okay, so what's the status of gay marriage in Israel, right? Like,
Right.
let's like it's not a queer utopia.
And also, there's no evidence that they would be stoning queer people to death unless you're taking like scripture literally, or you're thinking that they're ISIS, which they're not. In fact,
Right.
they're opposed to one
I
another.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so you look in the scripture and you say, "Oh, it's okay to stone, women or whatever." You look in the Bible and it's the same
right,
story.
there's like, these are
Of
like
course.
books that are over 1,000 years old, right? So they're not exactly holding up to our values of today.
But this is really, this whole discussion to me really centers on how in a sort of subconscious or often subtle way, Christianity and Western civilization are these interchangeable terms, right? And so the Judeo-Christian ethic is always sort of this underlying Western civilization. And then there's like the opposite of that, which is everyone else. And so it's sort of, as you noted, Eiynah, and Caitlin, of course, that these atheists, I like that term, the cultural Christianity, because that's really Western civilization. That's what they're actually saying. We are on this side, and this side seems vulgar. They never talk about the Muslims sending ships to Spain to pick up all of the Jews and the Muslims to bring them back during the Reconquista. We never hear about these things, only the bad things. And of course, that is to really push down the point that we are significantly different. Ramadan is not a Western holiday. We are not eating or during daylight to appreciate the positives that we do have in everyday life. How absurd!
Yeah,
know.
But
it's
let's
so
do some
boring.
intermittent fasting because Joe Rogan said to.
Right, yeah. So, because that's about science, okay? Intermittent fasting, that's optimizing your body for reasons that I don't want to talk about what the evidence is. But
And we know
yeah,
Joe Rogan is like extremely scientific and
that's right.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, he carefully weighs all the evidence and never changes his mind just because someone with big biceps tells him to. Uh, yeah, so I want to shout out some researchers, Aurelia Mondon and Aaron Winter, who write about Islamophobia and extremism, but also like Islamophobia as it's presented to kind of liberals and progressives, because we don't want to believe that we would fall for these things, but it happens, right? And so they talk about how you can like uh, you can explicitly reject something like the white man's burden or the clash of civilizations, which are these archetypes that position the West as white, pure, peaceful, virtuous, civilized, and the outside world as dark, scary, exotic, incomprehensible, and violent. You can say, like, well, obviously, I don't believe in that because that would be stereotyping. But then you can just watch these same narratives that follow the pattern continue to perpetuate, so that we still get this sense that like the Middle Eastern world as a monolith is that way: violent, dark, ugly, and exotic. And you
and
just have to protect it, protect Western civilization from it through
and
whatever's
what's
possible.
so shocking to me is that, I mean, in my lifetime, I feel like the West has been the most violent thing that I've known.
Mhm.
And it's so bizarre to talk like this about others when you are a way worse offender.
But Eiynah, the West has always been saying what Caitlin has been saying, always been saying that this Eastern element is
Mm-hmm.
incomprehensible, barbarism, such and such. And and if you read the authors in many of those countries during the time, they're doing science, they are making great innovations in culture. We are getting many of the wonderful innovations that we so enjoy, such as
Mhm.
the word alcohol, and coffee, right? And we are benefiting from
Coffee.
these great innovations, right? And there is just this perpetuation of the stereotype of barbarism.
Mhm.
And that certainly, I think, I mean, there have been some theories stating that, the Crusades functioned in many ways to dispel some of the violent angst that Europe would have otherwise taken out on themselves, as is evidenced by, the Protestant era later on, right? We're just itching for a fight. And the
But
difference
we're
is
the culture of peace. I don't understand what you're saying. What do you
Ri-
mean itching for a fight?
right, and their culture is ugly and strange, and ours is full of honoring like the blood of dead people, which is
Yeah.
totally not macabre at all, right?
Yeah,
I
right.
mean,
We have
just
to
that
think it very someday.
guy nailed to a cross. No offense. I mean, that is
And they put him right up there
odd
on the
symbol.
wall.
It's
I used to have to
extremely like, it reminds
yeah.
me of like fetish nights and stuff,
The
because they
kids
did
have
have
to,
those
like,
wooden
stare at this.
crosses there.
Yes.
Pardon?
I said the kids have to stare at this thing while we're in service. Like,
Yeah,
first of
we
all
just had our provincial elections, and they do them in like different neighborhoods, different schools in the neighborhood. And so this year ours was in a Catholic school. And so this is like, I guess, one of the few times that I've walked into a Catholic school. And as soon as you enter, there's like this giant guy nailed to a cross, and it's just so ominous. Like, it's so freaky.
it's so funny when you, like when you're going there every day, you're desensitized to it, but, like, when an
Right.
outsider
Yeah.
walks in and they're like, "What is happening?"
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
even when you're not, like, raised Christian, because it's I mean, I have my own issues with, how Islam doesn't allow sort of portrayal of
Right.
humans, like, that's another
Yeah.
thing, but, like, because we don't have that, we don't have these types of statues, right? Or
Right.
representations.
I mean, yeah.
So
I don't
it's
mind
even
like
more
Jesus in the field with the sheeps and stuff. Like that's lovely. But
right.
yeah, they get really gory sometimes. They get those artists get really excited.
They do. Like there's like
Right.
little blood painting, and you can see the veins and the muscles, and it's so lifelike. And to have that like right at the entrance of the school as soon as you walk in the morning, it's weird.
Well, Islam's foundation coincides with this sort of Eastern, like, iconoclastic movement of abolishing our fetishization of material, right? And so it, it is interesting. I am torn between the Islamic tradition of like representation through the beautiful language versus painting. Of course, like Caitlin said, give me some lambs in the field, 1,000% all day, right? But maybe
My
not.
church growing up, it was like a lot of doves and rainbows. That was great. Olive branches.
And you know, I don't even mind like gory art. Hey, go for it. But
Oh,
is
sure.
the school, I mean, most of my art is kind of gory, but
But
so
yeah,
I
the little
can't.
kids walking in there every morning.
Hold
I'm not
on.
putting it in kindergarten classes or
Hold,
anything. So.
hold on. I thought we had to protect the children. I was under the assumption that the children are incapable of handling anything subversive
Yeah.
to their little
No,
You
they
eggshell
only
got
have to
minds.
protect them from like diversity.
Oh, I
That's
see.
right.
I see.
Yeah.
It's the yeah. Yeah, okay, so speaking of diversity and I don't know, just all of the things that are happening right now. Like we have a real cultural fixation on masculinity as a virtue and femininity as like weakening. And what was so interesting from that same paper, and then I found a bunch of examples later, where there is this through line in the sort of liberal Islamophobia narrative of like the West has sort of hobbled themselves by being so sensitive and being so open to like feminine virtues like empathy that we are now weakened and
Mhm.
unable to defend ourselves from Islam. I found that so interesting. I saw it like in the Free Press. There was something
Very
like, oh,
Weiss's,
yeah, right.
right?
They said the West is drunk on peace. What will it take to wake them up? That it's like
Drunk
somehow
on
we're just like
peace.
not brave enough or awake enough to fight back. It was an interview with Douglas Murray, right?
Teddy Roosevelt called and he wants his weird rationale back
Mhm.
because drunk with peace, you mean prosperity? You mean like 70 years of relatively positive
Stability.
innovations? Right.
Yeah. How
You know,
awful.
Yeah.
I want to be drunk with peace like that, Eiynah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is a common thing. You'll hear that all the way from like Andrew Tate
Mhm.
to like Sam Harris and Douglas Murray. And I mean, I think Andrew Tate has said that Christianity got too woke, and so he
Yeah.
had to convert.
Mhm.
And obviously, he's not exactly a model
Yeah.
believer, so people question like how authentically he is like a practicing
Sure.
Muslim.
Oh, sure. But, like, we've got a Christian nationalist movement that's headed by Donald frickin' Trump, so,
Exactly,
like,
exactly.
that's what happens. The figureheads are frequently not paragons of the virtues, uh, that they even extol, right?
And
No.
also, when you talk about like Israel, you can see that they will kind of shift between being the Jewish state and using religion and religious iconography, or then sometimes it'll be preferable to be we're like a secular modern democracy
Right.
and whatever suits their needs in the moment.
Well,
Whoever they're trying to appeal
th-
to.
Yeah.
this is the same as any religious state. I mean, the Holy
Except for
See.
Saudi Arabia. I don't see them appealing to being a secular democracy or anything, but yeah.
No, no, I agree with that. I only mean insofar as um, these states that um, are allegedly religious institutions or a mixture of both, they have to function in some manner secularly. You know, they have to have secular ambitions because to run a Catholic state like the Holy See once upon a time as actual Catholics would be maladministration. No one else is playing by the Catholic rules. They're all playing by the rules of statesmanship. And so to not match that would be psychotic. But as you noted, you get leaders in these states who know how to play these games. They know they're more political than they are religious. The popes of the 16th century were more like senators and presidents than fathers of some type of religious group.
Right. Even in Saudi, like there have long been rumors about the royal families like not being religious at all and having like these wild parties and alcohol flowing, but they would keep the country locked down and adhering to all sorts of rules. That's been relaxed a little bit in recent years.
We have that happening here, right? Where like every once in a while somebody will get exposed because they pissed off the wrong person, like Madison Cawthorn or something, where it's like someone got mad at you and now everybody knows about your sex parties.
Yeah.
In the Victorian era, the greatest sin was not lechery or sleeping with anyone that you chose to, regardless of their position or sex, right? It was being caught. We can't let the normal people see that we are not living up to this standard, because in their perception anyway, which I think was probably wrong, but they're looking up to us. No,
it's more about the example you're setting than your actual behavior.
You guys are just full of shit.
I think there's definitely this like psychosexual anxiety about like getting cucked by the foreign horde, right? Which is gross, and a progressive would never admit to.
That's a paper title if I ever heard it.
I'll be writing it with Maureen Kossi, who's an expert in the semiotics of cucking. No, I don't. I would love to, though. That would be so fun. But like, that idea is so uncouth to say in its barest form. But if you make it about just defending something like peace or defending women or defending queer people, then it becomes okay, right? And like easier to package and sell to someone like me who doesn't want to feel like a racist. At which point I have to admit to you, Eiynah, to my great shame, that as a teenager I did watch Bill Maher.
So did I, Caitlin.
I thought it was good. Okay, great.
Me too.
Yeah, we both love Bill Maher. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Bill Maher specifically, because he continues to be like
annoying.
One of the most watched. Well, yeah, but like on Max, his metrics are still really good, which kills me, right? Obviously, he's not on like the main TV stuff like Fox or whatever, so he's not going to get those numbers, but he's got numbers, and he continues to sell himself as a liberal person. But what is his history with Islam?
Ooh, I would say white nationalist adjacent.
Right.
But people don't always recognize it. I didn't recognize it. You have to kind of know the dog whistles and stuff, right? Like early, like maybe 20 years ago, I think he had a panel where he was complaining about how there are too many babies named Muhammad born in Europe, which is not even his continent. And then he jumped from that to, and this is why Islam will take over the West. Mm-hmm. This birthright obsession is so creepy.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And it really, it shows how much people think about like non-white Europeans as being kind of like animals, where like they start using words like breed, and you're like, hang on a minute, like these are families.
Right.
It's difficult for me to understand like his arguments, to be honest, because they are a very young person. They are, to use the term you used earlier, Eiynah, right? They are like very edgelord arguments. And
also, he's appealing to an anxiety that you don't have and I don't have, which is that like there will be more brown people around. Like this does not bother me as a concept.
But it bothers a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. Right. No, it does absolutely bother people. But this whole argument of like religion is inherently bad because it prostrates people, it puts people into bad positions. Well, secular government does that as well. Anything that man touches, he turns into a potential tool of hardship. He is capable of making a democracy. He's capable of making an autocracy.
Mhm.
I'm not sold on the fact that, well, yeah, of course, Islam has killed people. Christianity has killed people. Our wonderful secular governments kill people all the time.
Right.
It's about
Doing it right now.
right. I'm living it. So it's
Yeah.
it's a matter of, why don't you grow up a little bit, Bill Maher? Grow up a little bit and realize we don't have to agree with everything that others do. But this is not the worst thing in the entire world either.
So these
Yeah.
are edgelord arguments in the way that they've been repackaged, but they're also like age-old white supremacist arguments as well.
Right.
And like old school racist arguments. Like there was this guy called Enoch Powell who gave this speech, this notorious speech in England. And even like like people who are otherwise racist have to like usually admit how racist his speech was. He got like it was about how the immigrants were coming over and were going to take over, and how even the doomsayers were like underestimating the problem. And I think Douglas Murray is one of the few people who says that actually no, Enoch Powell was also downplaying the issue. It's even worse than that.
Oh my
Wow.
gosh. He's so interesting because he's so extreme. Every time he opens his mouth, what he's saying is like deeply genocidal and like
Yes,
nakedly genocidal. And yet he still gets these profiles on like the Wall Street Journal
it's
where they
shocking.
call him Europe's Paul Revere. Like, oh, and they use words like he's warning us, like as they're just bought in, right, to the
Right.
narrative that he's selling.
But this is so extreme. It is like Richard Spencer extreme.
Right.
But
Oh yeah.
he's just using slightly, not even too much.
I think it's the accent, right?
Maybe it
He's
is the
literally
accent.
he's like, "We gotta clean them off the face of the earth, like, they're barbarians, we're civilized,
Yeah,
we're the army of light, they're the army of darkness," but he's got that nice accent, so then people are like, a scholar." I had to sit there and watch him talk. He was sitting in front of a mirror, so I was watching the back of his head most of the time, and just listening to him, every word out of his mouth was, like,
it's
murderous.
yes, yes. And it's so bizarre for me to just come to terms with this stuff because when I was a edgelordy, angry teenager, angry at the conservatives in my own society, I would just think like, wow, we are uniquely like a society that has just accepted the extremists in our midst, right? And how is this normalized and how can this be? But when you actually are clued into it in the Western world, it is possibly even worse.
Partly because there's very little pushback, right? Because they get these huge platforms and they talk like they're talking about something real, and all the journalists writing it down are like, "Yes, yes, very good point, sir."
I mean, all this exists at the same time when there are occasionally decent articles written about Douglas Murray, like calling his work gentrified xenophobia and other things like that. But he gave a speech once saying that we must make conditions harder across Europe for Muslims.
Right.
He's like, even through the genocide of Palestinians, he has explicitly expressed his support and basically said there are no innocent civilians.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. Eiynah, I would like your thoughts on something that crosses my mind fairly frequently when I'm thinking about Islam. Um, you know, in the West, and all of these folks that we're bringing up with their absolutely grotesque language, it strikes me that the idea of Islam as essentially like Wahhabist, right, in
Yes,
nature,
yes.
is completely a part of the Western perception of the religion. And I think that it might be useful, if possible, for us to sort of unwrap that for a second and talk about how this is actually a very specific strain of the thought
Yes.
that is relatively new in the history of the ideology.
Yeah, but a strain that is backed by wealthy, powerful people, and they are doing propaganda across the Muslim world. And I mean, so I grew up in Saudi, but I'm of Pakistani origin.
Okay.
So I'm familiar with like the landscapes in both the countries. I've lived in both places. And the Islam, when I grew up in Pakistan, was very, very different. It was very like taking a back seat, and the outfits were colorful and cultural. And
Right.
I have seen Pakistani culture be engulfed by that Wahhabist, Salafist strain of Islam, where head coverings and black cloaks are now like slowly, slowly, slowly taking over, you know? I mean, of course, we still have like these sort of like westernized pockets of society where, you know, there's like open bars and parties and
Right.
Yeah.
BDSM and all kinds of things. But I mean, yeah, that exists in Pakistan too.
Yeah. Well, and like you've got it's a top down thing, right? So you have this theocratic government that's controlling what people can do outside of their homes, but they can never really control what's inside of people's heads.
Or in their homes. Yeah.
Yeah, or inside of the walls, right? As long as they don't get raided.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think it's disingenuous, right, to say that like every single person who lives in the Middle East or identifies as Muslim is an extremist, uh, even when they're living under governments that are trying to force them to be.
Yeah, and this is also why I had an issue with like the progressive liberal sort of fetishization of modesty culture and Muslim women being one certain way, and just kind of flattening
Mhm.
the
Right.
image of what a Muslim woman is like. So you always see Muslim women represented as like wearing a hijab. I know it's a easy way, like it's like a shorthand if you're drawing something, but it's also like lazy and flattening, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, a visual shorthand can lend itself to stereotyping and making people feel like there's not other ways for them to be, right?
Yeah.
So illustrators, if you wanna draw a Muslim woman and you wanna indicate that she's Muslim, give her like a little necklace with the crescent.
Exactly.
Like,
Or earrings, or I don't
yeah,
know, a t-shirt, man, like
thank
Right.
you.
anything else.
Yeah.
Right. Right. I
It
mean,
doesn't have to be a hijab every time.
right, from India to Palestine, I mean, there is so much different culture, and really, I think what people lose sight of so often is that the modern cultures that we see of nations are really some type of older culture mixed with an indigenous culture in so many
Right.
instances, and so we see great varied belief and functionality. And that is part of the beauty of traveling. We don't want everything to be the same everywhere.
Yeah.
This is why I'm so glad my kids got into Mira the Royal Detective on Disney.
Oh, yeah, I
Has
love that
It's got
show.
such good representation because it's set in, like, a 19th century town in India, maybe, sort of,
Okay.
um, and it
Seems
and
kind of North American, but yeah,
I
okay.
know, well, a lot well, they do that thing that Disney always does, which is the, like, main characters all have an American English accent,
Yeah.
but then, like, the generation above them
Yeah,
all
yeah,
have,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah.
like, Indian accents and, like, other Middle Eastern
Well, that
accents, but
sounds like a whole nother episode, actually.
yeah. No, but, a lot of the episodes revolve around celebrating either, like, a Hindu holiday or a Muslim holiday or, like so my kids know about, like, Holi, they know
Oh,
about, like,
nice.
Eid,
How
they know
nice.
about, like, Tej, which I didn't know about, but now I know about, and I think it's so cool.
That's
Like,
awesome.
yeah,
What's
all
that
these fun
last one?
Tej, it's the festival of spring for I don't even know, like, I guess
I've
Hinduism.
never heard of it.
It's great. They, like, dance in the rain and wear nice outfits and have a picnic. So
Is
good.
that
It's for
Indian?
yeah, it's Hindu, yeah, it's for the
Oh.
goddess Parvati and her union with Lord Shiva, and it's during the monsoon season, so you just, like, lean into the fact that it's gonna rain a lot and just,
Uh-huh.
like, enjoy it.
Cool.
Yeah, uh,
See, we would do well to look back into the past and to see how incredible the human spirit was, right? Imagine living in a peninsula where it's gonna torrential downpour, and you're just like, you know what be great to do during this time? Let's dance.
We really coulda used Teach growing up in Phoenix where there's a monsoon season in late summer, like, 'cause you just have to deal with the fact that, like, your life is disrupted. There's gonna be flash floods, there's gonna be all this stuff, like, you kinda have to just stay home until it's over, and so you may as well have a party about it.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about, let's see, hang on, what did we cover? I have to go back through my outline. We talked about how it's easy to justify Islamophobia on the basis of, oh, because they're not nice to women, because they're not nice to gender and sexual minorities, but also a main through line that Mondan and Winter talk about, and that you and I have talked about, is turning the conversation away from these people are bad to free speech. I'm not allowed to criticize them, and that's the real problem.
Yes, and I hate to keep bringing Israel up, but like it's
No,
just such
okay.
a perfect example of how much hypocrisy there is around
Mhm.
all of these issues, right? The feminism thing, they are undermining feminism every chance they get here in the West, the right wingers who like to
Yeah,
use this, oh, well, Muslims are not nice to women kind of excuse. And they are rolling back women's rights.
Right.
And like you hear more and more of them say that, women shouldn't be in the public sphere. The other day I
yeah,
heard some Christian guy talk about how women shouldn't be podcasting. And I took that very personally.
yeah,
When you come for the women podcasters, like the five of us,
right? Having
Come
just joined the club, I would like to get some respect, please.
come come for me. All right. We have an oversupply of folks like me.
that's
Come for
right.
me. You know.
No,
And with the
not allowed
queer
to.
LGBT rights, I mean, they are constantly trying to roll back gay people's rights in the West. The right is,
Right,
while they
Right.
use this excuse of, oh, well, the Muslims are not nice to gays. And then with the free speech thing, I thought at least the anti-blasphemy crowd who turned basically everything into, well, this is like an Islamic blasphemy law, like
yeah,
silly little things like when people would criticize an article for having some kind of racist view. Oh, you want to impose an Islamic blasphemy law here? But they are not saying anything when at the behest of Israel, people are being deported, legal residents are being
right,
deported for protesting its genocidal actions.
right,
Or when movie theaters are being are wanting, people are trying to shut down movie theaters, people in power, because they tried to show that film that won the Oscar.
yeah.
Or
Or
how,
painting over murals in government buildings of, like, famous women from history or famous Black people from
yeah,
history.
Yeah. Any argument used is not a type of argument that would be reciprocally accepted. It is simply a cudgel. It's a cudgel
yes,
utilized
exactly, exactly.
to beat down.
Yep.
And so we have to keep that in mind when we're having these discussions and hearing these things. This is not an equal discussion.
At
Bringing
all.
up
Yeah.
a similar construct in their own world would not receive a similar response.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and also it's just used to shut down any if you're trying to bring up free speech rights, say on campus
Right.
in the West, it'd be like, but what about Islam? They'll do it much
yeah,
worse. Or like you're trying to
right,
bring up women's rights or gay, well, what about Islam? They'll do it much
yeah.
worse.
Or you'll say, like, okay, take for example Mahmoud Khalil, right, who got is well, they're trying to deport him, right? He's in Louisiana
Right.
right now. Um over protesting at Columbia, and the answer tends to either be you've got like Chuck Schumer just talking about procedure where he's like, well, due process and we'll figure it out and
No,
we've
but
got a
also
procedure that we
throwing him
follow
under the bus, saying that he's
100%.
despicable.
Yeah. And then you get, right, if you're like, well, this is a free speech issue, he's constitutionally protected as a protester. And they say, well, hate speech, though. He did hate speech. We're pretty sure he did hate speech, right?
But they
Which
don't point to
suddenly,
anything.
right. And if you want to come down on somebody for hate speech against a minority group, like, for example, Muslims, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there have been month-long outrages that a professor got mildly spoken to about, I don't know, using racial slurs in class, in class, or someone had a talking to at work, where these places have their own set of rules. Um, just because something is legal doesn't mean you should be doing it at work, right?
Yeah.
If a Nazi's speech is protected, doesn't mean that he's protected to be saying that stuff at his workplace.
Right. He's protected from like maybe legal persecution, but he's not just going to be allowed to act the same way at work,
Exactly.
like
But
through the policies of the workplace.
but we had this discussion with Brad. Remember, Caitlin? We had this
Mhm.
almost exact same discussion with Bradford Vivian.
Mhm.
The idea of free speech for many an individual is a fictional, mystical fairy tale version,
Yeah.
whereby
So
I
he,
can say anything, and no one. Not only can the government not do anything to me, but no one else can say anything to me at
No
all.
consequences. Yes.
right.
Zero
So
consequences.
yeah, he in his book he calls this First Amendment hardball, which is like an offshoot of constitutional hardball, and it's essentially like the selective appeal to free speech only when it benefits me and never when it benefits you. Um, yeah, so it's really just like my kind of speech supremacy rather than equality. Yeah. So yeah, we've got this unfolding story. This will come out in a couple weeks, so who knows what's happening with Khalil then. But a lot of mainstream publications and people who are registered Democrats and who are, liberals, the way that they would describe it. I don't identify with them. Um, it's a lot of focus on kind of painting a blurry picture of the guy as hateful and a terrorist so that we can feel okay with what's happening to him when the details they're just not there, right? It's
Right.
not.
And what they say is like, well, he is Hamas aligned.
Yeah.
And what
Okay.
is that? Because Hamas is opposed to Israel's genocidal actions. So anyone that opposes Israel's genocidal actions is technically Hamas aligned?
Your guess is as good as mine, right? Yeah, or like there were some upsetting flyers at Columbia at some point and therefore he must be responsible for them, like that kind of thing. Where you're
Mhm.
like, I don't think that's going to really hold up in court. At least I hope it doesn't, because that doesn't sound like good evidence.
I just don't have any faith anymore in
Honestly, yeah.
anything in your country, I'm sorry to say.
Oh, that's okay. I don't blame you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is constantly being overlooked, and you hear it, as you noted, Caitlin, in the excuses that you hear from folks. It doesn't matter if his language was despicable. That is actually of no consequence. He's a permanent resident, and you're not allowed to be kicked out of the country for saying mean stuff.
Right.
That's free.
Yes,
That's
but
freedom of speech.
so, I'm so sorry to tell you, but the Wall Street Journal says that being a green card holder means that you're obliged to disavow terrorism. And so, if you're not, like every second that you're drawing breath, being like, I hate terrorism, I hate terrorism. I don't know. I think we can
Gosh,
put you on a plane.
really gets in the way of my day to be doing
I
that
know.
all day
Like, you
long.
want to take a bite of your sandwich, but you're too busy going, I hate terrorism. So, but that's how you stay.
I've really been thinking a lot about these things in the past year and a half. Like when I see people openly celebrating, like, say, again, Israel's pager attacks, right, that killed children. Sam Harris wrote a piece on his Substack titled, like, Sometimes Violence is the Answer. Can you imagine if a brown man
No.
wrote
Honestly,
that?
no. Right. Sam Harris is particularly challenging for me because he is just like by his fingernails holding on to this image of being this like reasonable, rational, even keeled guy. And then you tune into his podcast and he's like, I don't know, maybe we should be murdering kids more.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus, guy.
Don't let the body count deter you, basically, is what he says, because one is moral and the other one is immoral, even if the body count is so like asymmetric.
Right. And then
One is done in the service of good, one is done in the service of bad.
So he can out of one side of his mouth be like, child murder, is it okay sometimes? And then out of the other side of his mouth say, quote, the truth about Islam is as politically incorrect as it is terrifying. Islam is all fringe and no center. My guy, you are all fringe.
That's right. That's right.
Seriously.
And
what are you doing?
Like one of his famous appearances on Bill Maher's show was that thing with Ben Affleck, right?
Right.
Where
Which was on Bill Maher. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And they had this big argument, and Sam talked about like these his theory of like concentric circles, right? There's like the extremists, and then the people around them, and then the people around them, and except like he's implying that they're all basically holding up that like terrorist core, right? But when he comes to talking about white supremacists, like after the Christchurch shooting and other white supremacist attacks, he did this like episode, which was unbelievable. And it was nothing but a series of excuses. He's like saying this is not motivated by sincere ideology, even though the guy left like a 50-page manifesto.
Here are all the things I sincerely believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Detailing his sincere ideology. He's like, because it was online, this is basically like online trolling culture and not white supremacy. When if you live in this decade, you know that these things can exist together, and they often do.
Right.
Well, yeah, like using the trolling as an excuse thing, far-right researchers have been looking into this for a long time, and it is a cover, and it is also like a welcome mat to people who aren't totally dedicated to the cause yet, right? Where it's like, well, we're just joking around here, but then if you're here for a while, you're going to start to like actually ramp up in terms of real world violence.
But then you see how he starts to split hairs when it comes to like, how many people do you think are like white people that are actual Nazis? But how many people do you think that are like, supporting those Nazis? Not many at all. Immediately from that second center, he never applies that second circle. He never applies that.
Meanwhile,
like concentric
our
circle
vice
theory.
president is a groiper. Like he just is.
I mean, he has said
he follows actual Nazis on social media.
In Trump's previous term, I think in the same breath, he said something like white supremacy, Sam Harris said on his podcast, is fringe of the fringe, even though it has captured the presidency. Just that make sense.
How do you make that work, right?
And this is a full circle type of deal right here, right? This comes back to that Western civilization, that cultural Christianity, that these are the same words. And so we have to deny that this is a murderous ideology. And so it cannot be related to Christianity. It cannot be sincerely Christian, because we know that sincerely Christian is Western society, Western civilization, and that is not barbarous, because we've identified that the other group that is not this is barbarous. So
it's binary, yeah.
Yes.
We also, I think because we live here in white Western society, we're baked in it. So it's always around, right? Just like those little kids walking into the Catholic school and seeing bloody Jesus on their wall. Like it doesn't necessarily ping any alarms for them. Like this is weird stuff, right? And so one of the principles, I'm gesturing this way, one of the principles in discourse analysis is when you're looking at some kind of cultural artifact or just like an event, you have to work really hard to pretend like you're an alien from outer space and that you've never seen any of it before, so that you can actually take stock of what's happening and why, and not do that selective comparison stuff where you're like, well, obviously that's all barbaric and this is all normal, because it's just easy to do because you lived there and that's just life.
Right. I mean, I did this podcast with a professor, historian, professor of classics a long time ago, Matthew Sears. I don't know if people remember him, but he was great on Twitter once upon a time. Then the far right trolls really like came after him and he quit. And I haven't heard from him since, but I hope he's well. And we did a chat about Orientalism. And we were talking about how I think in the early 2000s during the Iraq War, a lot of Americans were polled, including Democrats. Now, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it was like an alarming percentage where they were asked if we should, like we, the Americans, should be bombing the city of Agrabah, which is not a real place. It is from Aladdin, Disney's Aladdin.
Made up place where they live.
And without thinking, many people were like, yeah, absolutely. Including Democrats.
Yeah. With no other information. Like there's no, they did something to us. It's just like.
No, it's just the name.
Just the fact of the question legitimizes the option, right? Oh, should we be bombing them? Well, with a name like Agrabah, they must have done something, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Terrible.
So interesting. Ugh. Okay. So what did we learn today? Let's see. We learned to look out for selective criticism, right? We learned to watch out for disingenuous use of women and queer people and free speech as a prop. We learned to recognize the actual words that are coming out of somebody's mouth when it's really extremist, even while they tell us that they're not extremist or they have a really nice accent. Anything else?
Or a very slow NPR voice like Sam Harris.
Oh gosh. Sam Harris he did find his niche with like the meditation stuff because that voice. However,
it's so dangerous that he does that though, because that is just another avenue for him to draw more people in. Like people who aren't as familiar, they get into his meditation app and then he can slowly drip feed them the extremism.
Yeah, I mean, all of that is really valuable. And I really want to thank you, Eiynah, for coming to talk to us about it. And I hope we can have you back soon to talk about really whatever tickles your fancy. We love learning from you.
Yeah, anytime.
And everybody, please check out Polite Conversations. It's an amazing podcast. There's a mini series that I guess it's been a couple seasons now called Woking Up, which is just about Sam Harris. And I love it so much. I have listened to it multiple times. So thank you so much for coming on. And I will see you on Blue Sky.
Thank you, Eiynah.
Thank you for having me.
Half the answer, where knowing the question is half the answer.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.